Have you ever thought, I wonder what it would be like if you woke up in the Middle Ages with no smartphones, no fast food, no pizza, no soda, and so much more? Let me take you back to the Middle Ages and see if you could stay there for 24 hours. Now, turn off the lights, sit down, and if you like this kind of lighthearted storytelling, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if your heart says yes. Leave a comment and let me know where you're listening tonight and what time it is where you are. I always love to know who's out there drifting along with me. And here we go.
Imagine waking up one morning in the 13th century. The room is pitch dark. No electricity, no heating. The cold seeps straight into your bones. You're hungry, of course. But before you even think about toast with butter or a cup of coffee, brace yourself. Because your breakfast today will be pottage. Pottage was the main meal for peasants in medieval times. And it was nothing like the soup you might know. It was a thin, murky stew made from whatever vegetables a family could grow. Usually turnips, onions, cabbage, boiled in the same pot over the fire. Sometimes for days on end. Its taste? Bland, earthy, and occasionally sour if you forgot it was still simmering. And don't be surprised if you find a weevil or a piece of grit in your spoonful. Clean food prep was a fantasy. Another staple was bread, but not the fluffy golden loaves you're used to. Medieval bread was dark, dense, and coarse, made from rye or barley ground in stone mills. Bits of stone would chip off into the flour, meaning every bite was a dental hazard. People back then had strong teeth, not thanks to good hygiene, but because they chewed rocks with every meal. Worse still, that heavy bread often carried a toxic fungus called ergot, which grew on damp rye. This fungus was packed with neurotoxins and could cause hallucinations, seizures, burning sensations across the body, and in many cases, death. Some historians believe that mass outbreaks of ergot poisoning may have contributed to witch hunt hysteria. Imagine whole villages hallucinating because their baker didn't clean his tools properly. Don't. Meat. For the average peasant, meat was a rare luxury reserved for major feast days or moments of good fortune, like catching a wild rabbit. When meat was available, preserving it was a problem. Without refrigeration, people had to rely on smoking or heavy seasoning. But spices were imported and very expensive, so most people just ate the meat when it was less than fresh. The smell? Unforgettable. But they'd hold their nose and swallow, hoping for the best. If you're thinking about washing it all down with a glass of clean water, forget it. Drinking water in medieval Europe was a gamble with your life. Rivers, wells, and streams were often contaminated with human waste. People dumped chamber pots into the streets or directly into nearby water sources. The result? Widespread outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, and worse. So people, children included, turned to beer. Not the strong kind you might enjoy at the pub, but a weak ale called small beer, quickly brewed at home. It had low alcohol content but was safer than water because the brewing process killed bacteria. On average, fish was another protein source, but again, don't expect anything fresh. Those who lived near the sea had better chances of getting fresh fish, but for most people living inland, fish was dried or salted and took days, sometimes weeks, to arrive. By the time it reached the table, the smell alone could knock you out. So, there you are, sitting down for your first meal in the medieval world. A bowl of lukewarm pottage, a dense, gritty loaf of bread, a slice of dried, salty fish, and a mug of flat ale. You eat in silence, trying to swallow quickly before the bitterness creeps into your nose. That's breakfast, and possibly lunch, and dinner too. were no menus, no balanced meals, and certainly no choices. Eating was about survival, not satisfaction. If you were born in the 21st century, count your blessings every time you open a refrigerator, order takeout, or pour yourself a glass of clean water. Because if you were suddenly dropped into the medieval world, chances are you wouldn't make it past your second meal.
After forcing down a breakfast of gritty bread, sour stew, and questionable ale, you might begin to feel a familiar sensation deep in your belly. Yes, that one, the need to go. But before you reach for toilet paper or search for a nearby bathroom, remember, you're in medieval Europe now. There are no flush toilets, no porcelain seats, no privacy, no plumbing. You're about to experience one of the most horrifying parts of daily life in the Middle Ages: going to the bathroom. If you were lucky enough to live in a castle or a wealthier household, you might have access to something called a garderobe. At first glance, it seems almost civilized. A stone seat built into a wall with a hole in the middle. But when you look down, you realize that hole drops your waist straight down the side of the building, sometimes more than 60 feet. In places like Dover Castle, waste plummeted into open pits or onto the ground below, leaving the walls streaked with decades of filth. And that's the luxury version. For the majority of medieval people, especially peasants, toilet meant a chamber pot, a simple bucket or bowl, usually tucked under the bed, used by everyone in the household. No flushing, no water, just the raw, steaming remains of your digestive process, sitting in your room, waiting for someone, probably you, to carry it outside. And where would you dispose of it? Into a latrine pit? Rare. Into a sewage system? Almost non-existent. No, most people simply opened a window, shouted a warning, and dumped the contents right onto the street below. The phrase they yelled was "Gardez-l'eau," a distorted version of the French "Garde-l'eau," meaning watch out for the water. But this wasn't fresh water they were warning about. It was urine, feces, human waste raining down from above. In towns and cities, this practice became so common that rules had to be made. In some places, you were only allowed to toss waste out the window after 10 p.m. At night, narrow streets turned into foul-smelling rivers of sludge, especially after rain. Wooden walkways were built to help people cross without stepping directly in filth, but it hardly helped. Slipping into the muck wasn't just unpleasant, it could be deadly. Infections, parasites, and disease thrived in these conditions. For those who couldn't afford even a chamber pot, there were open-air toilets, designated corners of public areas where people simply relieved themselves. These places reeked, overrun with flies and rats, and the waste often made its way into nearby water supplies. Rivers like the Thames in London were so saturated with human waste, slaughterhouse runoff, and rotting trash that they were described as monsters of stink. Then there were the common privies, shared public toilets built over rivers.
Then there were the common privies, shared public toilets built over rivers or pits. In theory, a better solution. In practice, often overflowing and rarely cleaned. The smell clung to the walls, to your clothes, even to your hair. Using one was an act of bravery. But perhaps the most horrifying job of all belonged to the gong farmers. These men were tasked with collecting waste from cesspits and transporting it outside the city walls. They worked only at night, for obvious reasons, and not just because of the smell. The risk of disease, collapse of unstable pits, and the sheer revolting nature of the task made this one of the most dangerous and despised professions in medieval society. And yet, gong farmers were paid surprisingly well, often earning up to 4 times the wage of a regular laborer. But they paid a social price. The stench never left them. They were banned from taverns, churches, and gatherings. People crossed the street to avoid them. Their clothes were soaked with the filth they hauled, their skin stained yellow from exposure to human waste. Now let's talk about cleaning up. Toilet paper? Forget it. In the Middle Ages, people used whatever was available. Leaves, moss, hay, a piece of cloth, if you were rich, or in the most desperate cases, their bare hand. Often the left hand, which led to cultural taboos about using it for eating or greeting others. The ancient Romans had used sponges on sticks, rinsed in vinegar or salt water, but that knowledge was largely lost during the medieval period. So the average person did the best they could, and then wiped their hand on their already dirty clothing. Hygiene, as a concept, was minimal at best. So now imagine this. You've had your morning ale, eaten your questionable food, and now you're trying to find somewhere, anywhere, to relieve yourself in peace. But privacy doesn't exist. Homes are small, cramped, and shared by entire families. Everyone knows when someone is using the pot. Outside, the streets are foul. Public spaces are worse. If you live in a city, the very air smells of waste. If you're in the countryside, you might dig a hole, or not. Disease, parasites, and filth are everywhere, and no one knows what germs even are. People believe illness comes from bad air or imbalanced bodily fluids, not from the fact that they're living ankle-deep in human waste. This is the daily reality, not just for the poor, but for nearly everyone. So the next time you're sitting in a clean, tiled bathroom with flushing water, hand soap, and a roll of soft paper by your side, take a moment to be grateful. In the 21st century, we flush and forget. In the Middle Ages, there was no such escape. You didn't just live with filth. You lived in it. Let's say you've survived breakfast and somehow navigated the medieval bathroom horror without vomiting. Now it's time to go to work. Except in the Middle Ages, work wasn't something you did for fulfillment or career goals. It was something you did simply to survive. And for most people, that meant back-breaking, soul-numbing labor from dawn until dusk. If you were born a peasant, and statistically you almost certainly were, you didn't choose your job. Your job was the land. You woke with the sun and walked straight into the fields, whether it was freezing cold, pouring rain, or blistering hot. There were no weekends, no paid holidays, no lunch breaks, just a relentless rhythm of dig, plant, harvest, repeat, until your body gave out. A typical peasant farmer used wooden tools pulled by oxen. Plowing fields was exhausting work, especially with crude equipment that often broke or got stuck. You planted seeds by hand, hunched over for hours, and harvested crops with a sickle that dulled quickly. And when the harvest season came around, it was worse. 16-hour days under the beating sun, swinging tools nonstop, dragging sacks of grain or bundles of hay until your hands blistered and bled. Modern fitness gurus rave about burning 4,000 calories in a day. A medieval farmer did it just to stay alive. And what did all this labor earn you? Not much. Most peasants didn't own the land they worked on. It belonged to a noble who collected taxes and demanded a cut of everything you produced. If the harvest was poor, you still had to pay. If you couldn't pay, you faced eviction, or worse. The idea of minimum wage didn't exist. The minimum was simply survive or die. If you weren't in the fields, maybe you were one of the lucky few who learned a trade. But trades came with their own challenges and dangers. A blacksmith, for example, spent his days in a smoke-filled forge, hammering red-hot metal while sparks flew past his face. Burns were common. So were damaged eyes from stray bits of flying slag. You breathed in toxic fumes every day. There was no safety gear, no goggles, no ventilation, just fire, muscle, and pain. Or maybe you were a tanner, working in one of the most foul-smelling professions in human history. Tanners processed animal hides to make leather, and the process was horrifying. Hides were soaked in urine, lime, and even dog feces to soften the flesh. The smell was so overpowering that tanners were usually forced to live on the outskirts of town. Their skin turned yellow from chemical exposure. Their clothes reeked. The stench followed them everywhere. Want to avoid these jobs? Tough luck. Because if you didn't work, you didn't eat. And if you couldn't work, because of age, illness, or injury, you were seen as a burden. No social security,
no disability benefits, just poverty and death. In fact, your career likely started when you were still a child. If your family could afford it, and that's a big if, you might be sent off at the age of 7 to become an apprentice. You'd live in the home of a master craftsman, working 6 or 7 days a week, sweeping floors, carrying supplies, and slowly learning the trade. After 10 to 14 years, you might become a journeyman, and one day, maybe, you'd earn the title of master. But apprenticeships weren't school. They were labor, and often harsh. Some masters were cruel and abusive. Many apprentices were underfed, overworked, and punished for mistakes. There was no child labor law, no parental leave, no complaints department, just work and obedience. And if you didn't have a skill, if you weren't strong enough for field labor, then your options were grimmer still. You could become a link boy, a child who carried a torch to light the way for wealthy people at night. You'd walk the dangerous, foul-smelling streets, inhaling smoke, hoping someone would tip you with a coin. Or you might become a pure finder, a person who collected dog feces from the streets and sold it to tanners for use in leather production. Yes, that was a real job. The pay for most jobs was abysmal. A day laborer might earn 1 or 2 pennies a day, just enough to buy 2 loaves of rough bread, if you were lucky. And then, after working 14 hours, you'd go home to a shared room, eat the same bland food, and fall into a straw mattress crawling with lice, only to repeat it all the next day. There was no retirement. People worked until they died. And with poor nutrition, no medical care, and daily physical strain, that death often came in your 30s or 40s. Life in the Middle Ages didn't care if you were tired, sick, or in pain. You got up and worked, or you didn't eat. And if you couldn't eat, you didn't live. So, next time you complain about a long day at the office, or grumble about your 9 to 5, remember this. In the medieval world, every hour was a struggle. There were no time clocks, no labor unions, no HR departments, just sweat, dirt, and the looming threat of starvation. Still want to live in the past? After a long, exhausting day in the fields or forge, you might think rest would bring relief. But in the Middle Ages, rest wasn't the problem. Survival was. The human body, already strained by poor nutrition and back-breaking labor, was under constant siege from something even worse: disease. And the medieval world had little to no defense against it. Today, you get a cold, you take some rest, drink fluids, maybe visit a pharmacy. Back then, even the most minor illness, a cough, a fever, a small cut, could be fatal. That's because medicine, as we know it, didn't exist. There were no antibiotics, no knowledge of germs, and no understanding of how infections spread. People believed that disease came from bad air, miasma, evil spirits, or an imbalance of the 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to medieval science, if you were sick, it was probably because you had too much of one fluid, and the obvious cure? Get rid of it. Hence, bloodletting, one of the most common and horrifying medical practices of the time. Doctors, or more often barbers with knives, would slice open a vein and let you bleed into a bowl, believing it would restore balance to your humors. No sterilization, no gloves, no understanding of shock or blood loss. If the illness didn't kill you, the treatment might. Another common tool? Leeches. These slimy little creatures were applied to the skin and left to suck blood from your body. One medical manual even recommended using 70 leeches at once for certain conditions. The goal wasn't to heal. You just hoped the bad stuff left before your life did. But that was just the beginning. Dental problems? Imagine toothaches without painkillers. With no toothbrushes, toothpaste, or dental hygiene, tooth decay was rampant. When the pain became unbearable, there was only one solution: yank the tooth out with pliers or bare hands. Anesthetic? No. Sterile tools? No. just raw pain and the risk of infection or death. And what about childhood diseases? No vaccines, no pediatricians. Children died frequently. 30% of all kids died before their 5th birthday, often from treatable infections like the flu or diarrhea. Fevers that could be cured today with Tylenol and rest were death sentences back then. The average life expectancy? Somewhere between 30 and 40 years. And if you managed to live that long, it didn't mean you were healthy. Your body was worn out. Your joints ached. Your teeth were gone. You limped, coughed, and worked until you couldn't anymore. And then came the plagues. The Black Death, or bubonic plague, swept across Europe in the 14th century like a biblical curse. Between 1347 and 1351, it wiped out half of Europe's population, an estimated 25.
No one knew what caused it. Some thought it was punishment from God. Others blamed the air, or strangers, or even cats and dogs, leading to mass animal killings that only made the rat problem worse. Desperation led to panic, and panic led to cruelty. Entire towns turned on outsiders, lepers, Jews, and even women accused of witchcraft. The dead piled up faster than they could be buried. Bodies were tossed into mass graves. The streets smelled of rot and fear. Monks who tended the sick died in droves. Whole villages disappeared. And yet the plague wasn't the only killer. Diseases we now see as minor, measles, smallpox, pneumonia, tuberculosis, were all deadly in the Middle Ages. Without understanding how viruses or bacteria spread, people lived in filth, drank contaminated water, never washed their hands, and shared cramped, lice-infested spaces. Hygiene was an alien concept. Bathing was rare and sometimes feared. Many believed that hot water opened the pores and let in bad air. People might go months without washing, especially in winter. Clothes were worn until they rotted. Parasites like lice and fleas were accepted as part of daily life. Doctors, such as they were, practiced a mix of guesswork and superstition. Remedies included ground-up insects, boiled herbs, animal parts, or even mercury, which was highly toxic. Mercury was given for everything, from skin rashes to syphilis, which itself was rampant and untreatable. The cure often killed faster than the disease. Medical knowledge was based on ancient texts, written centuries earlier and rarely questioned. Experimentation was discouraged. Anatomy was poorly understood because dissecting corpses was illegal or taboo. Even the act of touching a sick person was risky, but caregivers had no other choice. So you lived in a world where illness was everywhere, where sneezing wasn't just annoying, it could be terrifying, where a scratch might lead to death, where healing was more superstition than science, and most people's first interaction with a doctor was also their last. And even if you did survive an illness, your body would never be the same. Weak, scarred, missing limbs or teeth, burdened by pain. People aged fast in the Middle Ages. At 40, you looked 70. At 50, you were considered ancient. So yes, it's easy to fantasize about a simpler time, a world without emails, traffic, or social media. But the next time you're lying sick in bed with the flu, wrapped in clean blankets, sipping filtered water, and taking modern medicine, just remember this. In the Middle Ages, you probably wouldn't have made it to tomorrow.
Let's say you survive the plague, avoid starving, and somehow keep your teeth and sanity intact. Good for you. But even if disease doesn't get you, something else might. The law. Because in medieval Europe, justice wasn't just brutal. It was random, cruel, and terrifyingly unjust. Start with this. There were no universal laws. Each town, each kingdom, even each lord could enforce his own rules. Something completely legal in one village could be a capital offense just a few miles away. And most people didn't even know what the laws were until someone accused them of breaking one. You wouldn't be read your rights, you didn't have any. The medieval version of a fair trial was more like a nightmare with an audience. Let's say you were accused of stealing bread to feed your starving family. Sounds minor, right? In many places, that could cost you your hand. And if the value of what you stole exceeded a few pennies, or, heaven forbid, it belonged to a noble, you might be executed. In medieval England, there were over 200 crimes punishable by death, not just murder or treason, but things like cutting down a tree in the king's forest or stealing livestock. The goal wasn't rehabilitation, it was fear. Trials were often based on something called trial by ordeal. You weren't judged by evidence or logic. You were tested by pain, and the belief was simple. If you're innocent, God will protect you. One common test? Carrying a red-hot iron bar for 9 feet. If your burns healed cleanly within 3 days, which they wouldn't, because this was the Middle Ages and infections were everywhere, you were innocent. If not, guilty. Another favorite? Trial by water. You'd be tied up and tossed into a river. If you sank, congratulations, you were innocent. Also probably dead. If you floated, it meant the water rejected you, so you were clearly guilty. Either way, it didn't end well. These tests weren't just cruel. They were rigged against you. Pain and fear were the point. And they were public. People would gather to watch, cheer, and jeer. Justice was as much entertainment as it was punishment. And if you were found guilty, prepare yourself. If the crime was serious, you might be hanged, which, horrific as it is, was one of the more merciful ways to die. But for crimes like treason, the sentence was being drawn and quartered. First, dragged through the streets by a horse. Then, partially hanged, enough to feel it, but not enough to die. After that, your body was disemboweled while still alive, then beheaded, and your limbs cut into 4 pieces. The remains were often displayed in public to serve as a warning to others. Still want to be a knight? Executions were public events. Whole families came to watch, bringing food as if it were a fair. Children.
For lesser crimes, punishment came in the form of public humiliation.
You might be locked in the stocks, a wooden frame that trapped your head and hands in place in the center of town. There you'd sit for hours or days while people threw mud, rotten vegetables, or worse, at your face. Some would spit, others might relieve themselves nearby. You weren't just punished, you were shamed. Women were often targeted with specific punishments. If you were accused of gossiping, nagging, or speaking out of turn, you might find yourself strapped to a ducking stool, a wooden chair at the end of a long beam. You'd be dunked repeatedly into cold water, sometimes to the point of near drowning. Why? To shut you up. And if you ever got into real trouble with the law, you might land in a dungeon, but not like the movie kind with dramatic lighting and mysterious torches. Medieval prisons were dark, wet, overcrowded pits. Prisoners were chained to the walls, or left to lie in their own waste. The state didn't feed you. You relied on family to bring food, or you starved. Rats were everywhere. So was disease. And torture? That was standard procedure, not just for punishment, but for extracting confessions. Devices like the rack, which stretched your limbs until they dislocated, or the thumb screw, which crushed your fingers, were used regularly. There was no such thing as a coerced confession. It was assumed that pain revealed truth. Some of the most feared devices included the Iron Maiden, a coffin-like sarcophagus lined with spikes, and the scold's bridle, a metal muzzle fitted onto the heads of women accused of gossip or witchcraft. Once worn, it prevented you from speaking, and often cut the tongue if you tried. Most people confessed to anything just to make the pain stop, even if it meant their death. The logic of the legal system was clear: confess or suffer, then suffer anyway. And if you were poor, things were even worse. Wealthy nobles could often buy their way out of punishment, literally. If you committed a crime and had the money, you could pay blood money to the victim's family instead of facing execution. Rich defendants could hire fighters to stand in for them in trial by combat, or bribe officials to look the other way. But peasants? They had no voice, no money, no protection.
just fear and hope that someone else got accused first. Even law enforcement was unreliable. There were no police as we know them. Towns hired night watchmen, usually elderly men or those unfit for other jobs. Their main job was to shout if they saw something suspicious. If a thief ran by, you might hear, "Stop, thief," and hope someone in the crowd stuck out a foot. The idea of innocent until proven guilty didn't exist. If you were accused, you were guilty until you could prove otherwise. And good luck with that, especially if you were illiterate, poor, or just unpopular. So yes, modern life can feel complicated and unfair. But the next time you're upset about a speeding ticket or jury duty, remember this. In the Middle Ages, justice wasn't blind. It was holding a sword in one hand, a torch in the other, and a crowd cheering for blood.
Let's say you've managed to survive disease, hunger, brutal labor, and the warped justice system. You've kept your head, literally. But just when you think you've earned a moment of peace, you hear the horns of war. Because in the Middle Ages, war was always just around the corner. The idea of living your whole life in peace was a fantasy for most medieval people. Wars were constant. Borders shifted, kings fought cousins, local lords raised militias over land disputes, and crusades swept through continents in the name of God. Conflict wasn't an exception, it was the rule. Take the 100 Years' War, a long, bitter series of conflicts between England and France that actually lasted 116 years, from 1337 to 1453. If you were born during it, you likely died during it, and your children might have fought in it too. There was no generation spared, no one untouched. But don't let romantic movies fool you. Medieval warfare wasn't all shining knights and honorable duels. It was chaotic, brutal, and unforgiving. Most soldiers weren't noble knights in shining armor. They were poor men, often forced to fight, armed with farming tools and little protection. Full suits of plate armor were rare and incredibly expensive, worth as much as a modern sports car. Only the wealthiest lords or kings could afford it. For everyone else, there was the gambeson, a padded cloth jacket, sometimes reinforced with bits of metal or leather, but barely adequate protection against arrows or axes. Weapons? Forget the elegant longsword. Most common soldiers used spears, axes, or even sharpened farm tools. The deadliest weapon on the battlefield wasn't a sword at all. It was the English longbow. It could pierce armor at 200 yards and was so powerful that archers trained from childhood, pulling 150 to 200-pound bows until their skeletons deformed from the strain. Their shoulders bulged unnaturally. Their spines twisted from repetition. The longbow won battles, but it broke bodies. And when battles happened, they were carnage. Take the Battle of Towton in 1461, part of the Wars of the Roses. In just one day, 28,000 men died, about 1% of England's male population. Many of them weren't killed in combat, but froze to death in the snowstorm that swept the battlefield. There was no glory, just terror, mud, and blood. Surviving the battlefield didn't mean surviving the war. Infection killed far more soldiers than swords. Wounds weren't treated. They were wrapped in dirty cloth or rubbed with ash. Limbs were lost to gangrene. There were no antiseptics, no antibiotics, just pain, rot, and death. And for peasants, the battles weren't even the worst part. What armies did between battles was even more horrifying.
Medieval armies lived off the land. That meant they took whatever they needed, grain, livestock, tools, clothing, from nearby villages. And they didn't ask. They burned crops, stole food, slaughtered animals, and destroyed homes. Women were raped, children were left orphaned, entire towns were emptied or erased. Even if the army spoke your language and waved your kingdom's flag, you weren't safe. Your village's suffering was part of their strategy. When battles failed, sieges followed. These were long, slow, agonizing campaigns where an army surrounded a castle or walled city and cut off all supplies. Food ran out, water ran low, hope disappeared. Inside, civilians starved. Rats, became delicacies. Cats, dogs, and eventually, other people were eaten. During the siege of Paris, hunger drove people to desperate extremes, and that was a short one. The siege of Candia in the 1600s lasted 21 years, the longest siege in history. Children were born and died without ever knowing peace. Diseases flourished during sieges. Thousands packed into tight quarters, sharing air, food, and water. Dysentery, typhus, and plague tore through both civilians and soldiers. In many campaigns, half the army died from illness before ever seeing battle. No matter who won, death was always victorious. And if you were a civilian caught in the middle, your choices were grim. Flee and face starvation on the road. Stay and risk violence, rape, or murder by marauding troops. Nobles were sometimes ransomed. Peasants were often slaughtered. Women and children were not spared. Armies didn't make distinctions. They needed food, shelter, and dominance. So imagine this. You've survived the plague, been tortured by justice, broken by labor, and now you're hiding in the woods with your children while your home burns. You're starving, you're barefoot, and the only thing louder than the horses galloping toward your village is your own racing heart. This was medieval war. And what did people fight for? Land, religion, honor, power, or simply because their lord told them to. You didn't get a vote. You didn't get a choice. If you were drafted, you fought. If you refused, you were hanged. If you deserted, you were tortured. And even if you were lucky enough to be a knight, war took its toll. PTSD wasn't diagnosed, but it existed. Veterans returned home changed, broken, sometimes mad. But there was no help, no support. You were expected to get back to work or die trying. The dream of riding gallantly into battle and returning a hero?
Let's imagine somehow you've survived the plagues, dodged war, escaped torture, and made it back to your village in one piece. You might think you're safe now, back home, finally. But in the Middle Ages, even normal life was a living nightmare. The first thing that hits you isn't hunger or fear. It's the smell. Medieval towns and villages were nauseatingly filthy. The air was thick with the stench of rotting food, human waste, unwashed bodies, animal blood, smoke, and disease. There was no garbage collection, no sewage system, and no real concept of sanitation. People dumped their chamber pots directly into the street. Butchers tossed entrails and blood outside their shops. Tanners, who worked with urine and animal hides, created clouds of stink so powerful you could smell them from blocks away. And rivers? They were open sewers. The River Thames in London, for example, was described by one chronicler as a monster of stink. With so much filth, how did anyone tolerate it? They didn't, not really. But they tried to mask it. The medieval solution to unbearable odor wasn't cleaning. It was covering up the smell. Wealthier people carried small cloth pouches called pomanders, filled with herbs and flowers which they held up to their noses. The logic was simple. If you can't remove the stink, try to smell something slightly less horrible. But covering up the stench did nothing to stop the spread of disease. The idea of washing hands, for instance, was nearly non-existent. People might wipe their palms on their already filthy clothes and call it clean. The same clothes they wore while butchering animals, walking through waste-filled streets, or dealing with corpses. Bathing? Rare. Most people washed only a few times a year, maybe in spring, maybe in late summer. In winter, it was common to go 4 to 5 months without so much as rinsing your face. The idea that bathing could make you sick was widely believed. Many thought that warm water opened the pores and allowed bad air to seep in. So, ironically, the dirtiest people were often the healthiest, not because filth was good, but because water was feared. As you might expect, lice were everywhere. Infestations were normal. Rich and poor alike scratched their scalps and wore special lice combs as part of daily grooming. Bedding crawled with vermin. Wool garments became warm homes for fleas.
And yet, all of it was just life. You were expected to endure it. Clothing didn't help. You didn't have a closet full of options. Most people owned 2, maybe 3 sets of clothes total. Undergarments were made of rough linen that chafed the skin. Outerwear was made of thick, itchy wool. Washing these garments was a laborious task, done with lye soap, if you had any, and cold water, so it happened only a few times a year.
And shoes? If you were lucky enough to own a pair, they were made of thin leather with flat soles. No cushioning, no arch support, and no insulation. Every step through muddy streets or frozen fields was punishment on your feet. Winter meant frostbite. Summer meant cracked heels and infections. Still, if you had a roof over your head, that was something, right? Sort of. The typical home in a medieval town was a single-room dwelling shared by the entire family. And by family, we mean everyone. Parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes even livestock. Privacy didn't exist. Everyone ate, worked, and slept in the same space. At night, people slept shoulder to shoulder, often sharing beds. During travel, inns might cram complete strangers into the same mattress to save space. A warm bed wasn't just a place to rest, it was real estate. Even the wealthy weren't immune to the loss of privacy. Nobles had servants present at all times, including while dressing, bathing, or even relieving themselves. The notion of personal space was practically alien. And then there's the language. You might assume you could get by speaking English in medieval England, but you'd be wrong. The language spoken in the 1400s was Middle English, which sounds completely foreign to modern ears. A simple question like, "What is your name?" would be spoken as, "What is Thin Nama?" And that's one of the easy ones. You'd struggle to understand anyone, and they'd think you were speaking gibberish. Even communication inside your own family wasn't guaranteed, especially in regions where dialects varied dramatically from one village to the next. And since most people were illiterate, you couldn't write things down either. If a message needed to be sent, it was delivered by foot or horseback, traveling at the speed of exhaustion. Meanwhile, entertainment options were few and far between. Most people didn't have time for leisure. Days were spent working, nights were for sleeping. But on the rare occasions people had free time, their options were limited. You could attend a public execution, a local favorite, watch a bear baiting match, or listen to traveling performers if one happened to pass through town. For most, fun meant listening to local gossip, watching the fire burn, or, if you were lucky, hearing a bard recite a tale of kings and dragons, stories far removed from your dirty, lice-ridden life. The idea of relaxation, of shutting a door and having a moment to yourself, was a modern luxury centuries away. In the Middle Ages, you didn't own space. You shared it. You didn't manage time. You endured it. So as the fire crackled in your one-room home, your neighbors coughing beside you, and your boots rotting in the corner, you might close your eyes and dream of a better world. One with soap, clean sheets, a private toilet, a hot shower, your own bed. Because in the 21st century, we call those things normal. In the Middle Ages, they'd be magic. If you made it this far, surviving war, filth, disease, torture, starvation, and total lack of privacy, congratulations. But your greatest challenge in medieval times might not be physical at all. It's mental. Because the Middle Ages weren't just dangerous, they were terrifyingly ignorant. In a world before science and reason became the backbone of society, superstition was king. The stars dictated your fate. Spirits caused your illness. Witches hexed your crops, and a sneeze might mean possession by demons, or just that someone nearby needed to be burned at the stake. People weren't stupid, but they were desperately uninformed. Without access to books, education, or verified knowledge, the average medieval person filled in the blanks of the world using a mix of religion, folklore, and fear. Everything that couldn't be explained was considered magic or divine punishment. Imagine getting sick with a fever. Today, we know it could be the flu, a bacterial infection, or even dehydration.
In medieval Europe, the diagnosis would likely be one of two things. 1, you've been cursed. 2, God is punishing you. The treatment? Pray, bleed, or burn something, or someone. Medicine was ruled by the ancient theory of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Every illness was believed to be an imbalance of these fluids. Got a headache? You've got too much blood. Let's drain it. Got a stomach ache? That's too much yellow bile. Let's give you something that induces vomiting. The cures often made you worse. Many died from the treatments rather than the disease. And because people believed in magical causes, they looked for magical solutions. That's why astrology was taken seriously. If Mars was in the wrong house, you might avoid travel, postpone planting crops, or cancel your child's baptism. The position of the stars could decide everything from medical procedures to legal trials. It gets darker. When crops failed or livestock died mysteriously, people didn't assume bad weather or disease. They looked for someone to blame. Often that meant accusing a neighbor of witchcraft. And because fear is contagious, accusations spread like wildfire. One person could be labeled a witch, and suddenly a dozen more were pulled into it. And in a world without evidence, the mere act of denying witchcraft was seen as a sign of guilt.
Many historians believe that ergot poisoning, caused by a fungus on rye bread, may have led to mass hallucinations, which in turn fueled witch hunts. Villagers thought they saw flying witches and demonic figures. In reality, they were just suffering from toxic food. But without knowledge of fungi, toxins, or mental illness, these visions were taken as proof. Even natural events terrified people. A solar eclipse wasn't a rare cosmic phenomenon. It was a sign from God, often interpreted as a warning or omen. Entire towns would stop work, pray in the streets, or flee into the woods. Comets meant death. Storms meant wrath. A stillborn child was a message from the devil. And when people didn't know the answer to a question, they didn't look it up. They asked the oldest person in the village if they'd ever heard of something similar. Medieval fact-checking was based on age, rumor, and hearsay. No scientific method, no controlled experiments, just oral tradition and fear. Communication made everything worse. There were no newspapers, no radio, no centralized government system to spread verified information. News traveled by messenger, often on foot or horseback. A message from 50 miles away could take days to arrive. International news? Weeks or months, if it ever got to you at all. And by the time it did, it was probably wrong. Stories changed with each retelling, like a village-wide game of broken telephone, only with real consequences. Literacy was rare. Only monks, scribes, nobles, and some merchants could read and write. Books were hand-copied, extremely expensive, and often filled with religious or mythical content, not practical facts. If you were a commoner, everything you knew came from the local priest, traveling gossip, or your grandfather's half-remembered tale from 40 years ago. Even people in positions of power, lords, mayors, even kings, based decisions on superstition and myth. Medicine was prescribed based on dreams. Legal punishments were handed down based on visions or astrology. A noblewoman might carry a dead toad around her neck to ward off illness. A farmer might bury a cat in his field for better crops. A town might sacrifice animals to stop a disease outbreak. It wasn't just that people believed strange things. It's that they had nothing else to believe in. There was no safety net of knowledge, no Google, no doctor you could call, no weather report to consult. Every disaster, every strange illness, every bad year was interpreted through a lens of fear and faith. And in this kind of world, hope was fragile. A single thunderstorm could send a village into panic. A failed crop meant not just hunger, but divine retribution. A wandering stranger might be welcomed or burned, depending on how superstitious the locals were feeling that week.
In the modern world, we're surrounded by answers. We understand germ theory, nutrition, astronomy, mental health. We know that a fever isn't a curse and that the stars don't control our destiny. But in the Middle Ages, there were no such certainties. The unknown was everywhere, and it was almost always feared. So yes, the medieval world had castles and knights, but behind the stone walls and heroic stories was a society that feared everything it couldn't explain, and explained almost nothing correctly. If you value reason, science, and truth, the Middle Ages would break your mind just as fast as it broke your body.
After 8 chapters of disease, violence, filth, superstition, and unrelenting hardship, you may be wondering, was there anything good about medieval life? The truth is, not much, especially if you are a commoner. And that's exactly the point. When we romanticize the Middle Ages, we're often thinking of castles, banquets, knights in armor, and maidens in flowing dresses. We picture simpler times with strong values, epic quests, and honorable codes. But for 90% of people, peasants, laborers, servants, life was not a fairy tale. It was a slow, grinding test of survival. Let's revisit what you'd be giving up by traveling back in time, just 600 to 800 years. 1. Medicine and healthcare. In the Middle Ages, catching the flu could kill you. A cut on your finger could get infected, leading to amputation or death. A toothache might end in jaw rot. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no antiseptics, and no trained medical professionals for the average person. Healing often involved leeches, bloodletting, and mercury. Today, we have hospitals, pain relief, sanitation, and a trained doctor a phone call away. We have science. They had prayer, herbs, and luck. Food and nutrition. Modern food might be processed and sometimes unhealthy, but at least it's clean, refrigerated, and varied. In medieval times, meals consisted of moldy bread, boiled gruel, and possibly rotten meat. Spices were used to mask decay. Water wasn't safe to drink, so children drank ale. Nutritional deficiencies led to stunted growth, bad teeth, and early death. Now, you can walk into a supermarket and choose from thousands of safe, fresh options. That's not normal. That's a miracle of modern life. 3. Sanitation and hygiene. Let's be clear. Everyone smelled bad. People bathed a few times a year, if at all. Waste was thrown into the streets. Lice, fleas, and infections were everywhere. There was no soap, no toilet paper, and no indoor plumbing. Public toilets were pits over rivers. Garbage was dumped outside your front door. Modern sanitation, hot showers, deodorant, flushing toilets, clean towels, is a luxury so familiar we forget it's miraculous. 4. Work and labor. In the 21st century, you may hate your 9 to 5, but compare it to a medieval peasant's day. 16 hours of manual labor, plowing, planting, hauling, chopping, in rain, heat, and snow. Tools were crude, safety non-existent. Children worked from the age of 7. Rest was rare. Injuries were common. And no, you couldn't quit. A modern bad day at work would be a dream to a medieval farmer. 5. Law and justice. Today we have courts, lawyers, and the principle of innocent until proven guilty. In the Middle Ages, you could be punished for looking suspicious. Trial by fire, water, or torture was common. Steal a loaf of bread? Lose a hand. Get accused of witchcraft? Burn at the stake. Our legal systems aren't perfect, but at least they're grounded in rights, laws, and due process, not superstitions and public spectacles. 6. War and violence.
Today, most of us live our entire lives without seeing war firsthand. In the Middle Ages, war came to your door. Armies burned villages, battles slaughtered tens of thousands. Soldiers stole, raped, and killed indiscriminately. Starvation and disease followed them. Sieges lasted months or years. You might die fighting or you might die running. There was no safety, only survival.
8. Privacy and personal space.
In medieval towns, privacy didn't exist. You slept in a one-room hut with your entire family. Strangers shared your bed at inns. Even nobles had servants attending them constantly, even on the toilet. Gossip spread fast, secrets were impossible to keep, and your status was written in dirt, clothing, and accent. Modern life, with private bedrooms, locked doors, headphones, and solitude, is something they literally couldn't dream of.
The next time you're frustrated by a slow internet connection, or groaning because your favorite restaurant messed up your order, take a moment to imagine life in 1325. Imagine hunger that kills, pain with no relief, cold that seeps into your bones, the fear of illness with no cure, the constant threat of punishment, violence, and superstition. In medieval times, just surviving another day was a victory. Reaching age 40 was rare. Clean water was a treasure. A warm bath was a memory. A toothache could be a death sentence. You don't need a time machine to experience the Middle Ages. Just turn off your heat, throw your mattress away, eat only porridge, and try to live without medicine, privacy, or safety. Most of us wouldn't last 24 hours. So yes, modern life is stressful, but it's also comfortable, clean, educated, and long. We live longer, eat better, feel safer, and know more than any generation in history. The Middle Ages were not magical, they were miserable. And the greatest magic of all, you were born now.